If you've ever played this, or this, then you may have heard of these guys. Hold on. Insomniac Games is and has been one of the most beloved Western video game studios for 4 generations of consoles. Incorporated in 1994, Insomniac has enjoyed a long and productive relationship with Sony Interactive, one that has produced some of the most iconic PlayStation titles of all time. Mind you, it hasn't always been an exclusive relationship. The two were free to see other companies, but last year Sony took things to the next level, acquiring Insomniac for $229 million. However, the journey of 1,000 Ratchet Clank games began not with Spyro the Dragon, but with Disruptor, a first-person shooter for the PlayStation and the first Insomniac game. Released in 1996 and touted as the mother of all shoot-'em-ups, Disruptor is unashamedly a clone of the original Doom by id Software, which itself helped to define the genre. The rookie team at Insomniac fought an uphill battle to have it published, but sadly, while certainly well-liked, Disruptor was a commercial failure, selling only 200,000 copies worldwide. This shattered morale at Insomniac and brought the company to the brink of bankruptcy.
There were times where we really thought we were not going to be around for another week.
And not very promising for its first effort. But with Insomniac Games now responsible for not one but 2 major titles on the PlayStation 5, to say that they bounced back is something of an understatement. Now, I don't know much about first-person shooters, and if it is possible, I know even less about the Doom series, but I've been following Insomniac Games ever since I grew up with Gateway to Glimmer in the 1990s. I've beaten every Spyro game and every Ratchet Clank game, and I've even dabbled in some of Insomniac's more obscure games like Fuse and Song of the Deep. So when I got my hands on Disruptor, I was intrigued and saw the chance to trace those things that I like about Spyro, Ratchet Clank, even Resistance and Marvel's Spider-Man, back to where Insomniac Games really began. What was Disruptor like? What about it worked or didn't work? Was it any fun to play? And how did it manage to pave the way to the successes that we know Insomniac for today? My name is Wongerz, and today the game is Disruptor for the PlayStation. Well, that was oddly sinister. Before Insomniac Games was Insomniac Games, it was a group of sleep-deprived video game developers in need of a new name.
We were all Insomniacs at that point. We weren't sleeping at all.
But before that, it was Extreme Software, and it was under that name that businessman Ted Price and programmers Al and Brian Hastings started work on Disruptor back in 1994. It was probably a daunting project to say the least. Having just graduated from university, none of the trio had worked on any games before this, and Price had invested heavily in getting this new dream business of his off the ground. Fortunately, the Hastings brothers had a natural talent for programming, and a playable demo version of Disruptor was completed after only a month. Still, the odds were against Disruptor ever seeing the light of day. Doom had revolutionized the first-person shooter genre a year earlier in 1993, and as a Doom-fueled hysteria gripped the games industry, developers scrambled to take advantage of it. The result was a deluge of Doom clones that Disruptor would have to compete with. The original choice in platform for Disruptor was also less than ideal. The Panasonic 3DO had started to lose sales to both the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn, but the dev kits for the 3DO were cheap and more accessible to new developers, so it was likely all the team could afford to get. To top things off, Extreme Software struggled to find a publisher. Ted Price and Al Hastings drove all over California presenting Disruptor to publisher after publisher, but were turned down each time. Apparently, and ironically, they had even pitched Disruptor directly to Sony. Their last stop, and the last chance for Disruptor, was at the newly minted Universal Interactive Studios. The executive producer there, Mark Cerny, saw that Extreme Software was very talented for a team with no experience, and signed it on for a 3-game publishing deal. With the support of Universal, Sony finally convinced the team that moving Disruptor to the PlayStation would better its chance at success, and the game was ported only a few weeks later. This would be the big turning point in the story of Insomniac Games. As we know now, Universal would extend its deal to publish the original Spyro trilogy on the PlayStation, and Mark Cerny would work with Insomniac again on Ratchet Clank, Resistance, and Marvel's Spider-Man. But it also put the team next door, literally, to its rivals and eventual collaborators at Naughty Dog, who allegedly had presented Way of the Warrior to Universal on that very same day. Disruptor takes place on a cold day in the far future. Humanity has moved out into space and colonized the planets of our solar system. You play as Jack Curtis, a young recruit to the Lightstormer Corps, an elite force of enhanced soldiers operating across space and with headquarters on Earth. Jack is naive, but eager to prove himself. His father was a famous Lightstormer and his own brother is his commanding officer, so becoming a Lightstormer is like a rite of passage to him. As a new recruit to this elite cadre, you must learn the ropes of survival in a hostile universe. Soon you'll become proficient in the use of a wide selection of firearms and close-quarter battle tactics, and if you don't, this will be a very short enlistment. In other words, if you turn out to be a casual, then they will fire you. Or you'll die. I suppose the manual isn't too clear about that. Being a Lightstormer, you'll carry out missions for United Earth on different continents and planets. Each plays out as a level with a simple point A to point B design. To complete a mission, you have only to safely navigate to the exit teleporter at the end of the level. Straightforward stuff, methinks. But naturally, those levels are implausibly packed with gun-toting, fire-breathing, sprite-based baddies determined to blast the living suitcase out of your already carbonized and equally sprite-based carcass. So it's up to you to stay alive and do it to them first in the name of galactic democracy. As you climb the ranks, you'll be enhanced with neurosurgical implants that grant you access to mental abilities called Psionics. Armed with these and an assortment of suitably science fiction-y firearms, you'll travel the solar system to battle insurgents and uncover a conspiracy threatening United Earth, all under the watchful and not at all suspicious eyes of the Lightstormer commander, President Krieger. Intrigue and deception are a part of the expanding universe. Miss one clue, and for all your vaunted weapons and powers, you'll be shipped home in a pine box. Did they mean that literally, and if so, would it not be cheaper and far more prudent to build a box out of something that wouldn't instantly vaporize upon re-entry into our atmosphere? Aluminium, perhaps. Again, the manual is suspiciously vague. Starting a new save file, you're shown Disruptor's opening cutscene, which I can safely say is the most photorealistic opening cutscene that I've ever seen, and dropped into some training missions. The basic controls are a bit awkward at first, but they are mostly quite standard. In addition to strafing left or right with the L1 or R1 button, and interacting with doors or levers with the triangle button, you can bring up a weapons menu by holding down the R2 button, and a psionics menu by holding down the L2 button. You can select a weapon or a psionic with the directional pad and activate your chosen psionic by pressing the square button. Confusingly, you shoot with the X button and jump with the circle button. And while that does feel horrendously unnatural after more than 20 years of playing hundreds of games in which those two controls are generally reversed, you do get used to it with time. You may be jumping when you mean to shoot and shooting when you mean to jump for a while, but thankfully there are only a few spots where jumping is absolutely necessary. If the controls don't suit you, then there are 3 other controller options to choose from, but I found that the default layout was the most comfortable. Disruptor was released before the DualShock controller came along, so there are no analog sticks here. Movement is only possible with the D-pad, which tends to be imprecise. Jack runs and turns ridiculously fast, and he sways around a lot when he moves. So stopping yourself in the right place or facing the right way to shoot an enemy is a bit hit or miss. Sometimes you stop on the mark, sometimes you're a little off, and sometimes you completely overshoot the mark and, well, get shot. If you're expecting fast-paced gunplay with pinpoint accuracy right out of the gate, then you may be disappointed with Disruptor's initial clumsiness. But again, you do get used to its controls over time, and as you do, actions start to flow more naturally. And speaking of things that don't quite flow so naturally, this may be a good time to talk about Disruptor's cutscenes. If you'll just come with me.
Walk softly and carry a big stick, especially when you sidestep the corners, and you'll do just fine.
Insomniac took cues from games like Warhawk and Wing Commander 4: The Price of Freedom, presenting the story of Disruptor between levels in a series of live-action cutscenes, complete with actors, sets, costumes, and CGI. Love them or hate them, live-action cutscenes are at least unconventional, and because of that they can help games to stand out, which I suppose Disruptor would have needed to do to distinguish itself from other Doom clones. In a way, it sort of makes sense that they were used here. After all, Insomniac had just partnered with Universal Interactive, whose parent company was a giant in film and television production. Universal supplied Insomniac with actors and sets, but the team had minimal space and a very limited budget to work with. And according to Ted Price, the whole process was plagued with production issues, which couldn't be fixed because they couldn't afford to reshoot any scenes. And to be honest, the acting on display here is less than stellar.
All the psionics in the world couldn't have saved him from that terrorist ambush.
soon as you lower this force field, there'll be hell to pay.
Hell was already paid, Lieutenant, by the innocent thousands who died on New Atlantis.
But I tell you one thing, it did wonders for my psionics. You know, if Dad had one of those orbs, I bet he'd still be with us today.
I'd like that.
Clearly Insomniac thought so as well, because they actually have it written here in the manual. As a note in general, you should watch all of the video interludes to gain valuable mission information. You never know what will turn up between missions. I wonder if they knew at the time that one of those things to turn up would be bad writing, because an actor can only do so much with a bad script, and Insomniac itself was responsible for script writing. So I don't think that they're entirely beyond blame for the cheesy cutscenes.
He's got to be stopped.
Why me?
We've been scanning the solar system for someone with strength, wisdom, and integrity. Someone we could trust with man's most powerful weapon.
You know, I remember when I requested the funds for a teleporter that looked like my office. The bean counters thought that I was just acting paranoid.
Until this morning.
Now, before we mock Disruptor too much for its low-budget cutscenes and at best average acting, keep in mind that experience is experience. Disruptor's lead production designer, Catherine Hardwicke, would go on to direct Twilight. Now, am I saying that Disruptor gave us Twilight? And more importantly, is Disruptor a better love story than Twilight? Leave your answers in the comments below, etc., etc. Believe it or not, I actually enjoyed watching these cutscenes. The cheap sets and cheesy acting give them a camp, over-the-top sort of feeling, almost like they're parodying science fiction films rather than just trying to duplicate them. And when characters are killed, I still felt enough of a connection to Jack that I actually felt bad for him. I even recognized Vaughn Armstrong, who plays President Krieger, from several bit parts that he'd later play in the Star Trek universe. But there's no denying that the cutscenes clash with the overall tone of the story that they try to tell. Insomniac intended for Disruptor to be properly dark and dramatic, a story about a young man who suffers very personal losses and has to do some serious growing up before he can restore peace to the galaxy. I guess that I'm just so used to the cynical and satirical humor of the Ratchet & Clank games that it's difficult for me to accept that Insomniac would want to tell a completely humorless story. The irony though is that I genuinely did laugh through most of these cutscenes, if for the wrong reasons. What I can accept though is that combat is what Disruptor is all about. There are no puzzles, platforms, or vehicles to contend with here, only the throng of robots, mutants, and pirates that bars your way to the exit teleporter. As you might expect if you're an Insomniac fan, your arsenal is futuristic and highly stylized. Insomniac wanted to differentiate between each weapon as much as possible, a creative philosophy that they would carry over into Ratchet & Clank, Resistance, Fuse, and Sunset Overdrive. The weapons here are nowhere near as absurd as in those games, but no two weapons feel the same to use. Which is good, because in Disruptor the weapons are your tickets to different styles of gameplay, and you can choose whichever one suits your style. My favorite was the AM Blaster. It's a wide-range shotgun type weapon that fires a more powerful shot the longer you charge it up, like the shock cannon from Up Your Arsenal. It deals high damage at close range and can knock enemies backwards, so it's perfect for taking out enemies in risky hit-and-run attacks. For spots where you need to play more cautiously, and there are more than a few, you'll want to rely on the lock-on cannon, which launches floating mines that home in on enemies at a distance, even through fog or around corners. Before all that, you start with a standard 18mm pistol that deals minimal damage but fires quickly with a large magazine. You use this to learn the basics of running and gunning during your first mission at the Lightstormer Academy. Once you reach the next level, the Chemical Factory, you unlock the Phase Rifle, a precision energy weapon with a slow rate of fire. From there, you unlock a new weapon with every level or so. Most weapons can be equipped with upgrades that you find by exploring levels, like the Phase Repeater, which can be upgraded with red high-frequency rounds to increase its rate of fire. Some weapons also share the same type of ammunition, like the AM Blaster and the AM Cyclone. This introduces additional strategy, since using one weapon now may mean that you can't use the other one later on. There are no Gadgetron vendors in this universe, so once you run out of ammo, you're not getting more unless you can find it or pick it up from a defeated enemy. With only 6 weapons to choose from, Disruptor's arsenal can seem a bit sparse, particularly when compared to Ratchet & Clank. But in certain spots, usually where hordes of enemies might otherwise tempt you to exclaim, "What a load of bullshit," you can usually find one of 2 special weapons hidden nearby, the Plasma Lance or the Zodiac. These unauthorized guns can clear entire rooms, but can only be fired once before they become useless. They're a lot of fun to let off the chain and can be stored for later in a level where you might need them more, or even where you don't need them. Psionics come into play in more of a mixed bag. Some are obviously offensive, like Blast, which involves throwing and detonating an enormous ball of energy, but most are designed to be defensive, like throwing up a shield or healing damage. Which again is good, because there really isn't much in the way of cover in these levels. Your first Psionic, Shock, sends out a short-range electrical attack that destroys most small enemies. After the Chemical Factory, as with the weapons, you unlock a new Psionic with every level or so, for a total of 5 abilities. It's up to you to make sure that your weapons and Psionics are stocked and ready to go for when you need them. But when they inevitably fail, you'll at least have your trusty stick to fall back on to swat away the hordes with. It's about as useful as it sounds, so to give you an idea,
Walk softly and carry a big stick, especially when you sidestep the corners, and you'll do just fine.
yes, indeed, walk softly and carry a big stick. That one I think they may have taken a bit too literally, but there's not much we can do about it now, is there? Make no mistake, though you may have whiled away your childhood weekends gallivanting around Avalar, dispatching the occasional lava lizard, or maybe a more substantial threat like a goat, Disruptor does not mess around. In fact, it makes things harder than they really need to be. Levels can seem claustrophobic, and enemies are often waiting to jump out and attack even if they're behind you. They react quickly, chasing you around and shooting at you from a surprising distance. You'll tank a lot of damage while you turn to shoot each enemy, and when the difficulty spikes and Disruptor starts throwing armies at you, it becomes easy to fall into the trap of being outmaneuvered and killed. The difficulty fluctuates wildly between levels, and there are some conditional levels as well. For example, some levels will deprive you of your weapons and leave you to rely entirely on your psionics for the whole level. These do the job of varying up the gameplay, but psionics don't keep you safe along without weapons, leading to some embarrassing situations in which your best chance at survival is just to run past everything. When you die, you pick up from the continue point at the halfway mark of the level. Yep, the continue point. Singular. And if you die more than 3 times, you'll get a game over and have to start again from the beginning. You can increase your maximum health with upgrades hidden throughout the game, but there's no way to increase the number of lives that you have. And with levels that can take upwards of 30 minutes to complete, having only one continue point seems unreasonable. Whether any of this can be justified is of course up to the player, but during my initial playthrough, which lasted for about 7 hours, there were several times at which it became so tedious to have to repeat the same sections of long levels after every death that I really wanted to stop playing. And my woes boiled down to a simple problem. I never had enough energy to use my psionics. Unlike ammunition, you can't gain psionic energy by finding it hidden throughout the level. Once you run out, the only way that you can continue to use psionics is by producing psionic energy with the drain psionic. By pressing the square button, you can drain an enemy of their energy, but you can't actually collect it for yourself until the enemy is destroyed and you move into the blue orbs of energy that they leave behind. You only have a few seconds in which to do all this before the energy disappears, so to have drain pay off you need to be very quick. It's not intuitive at all, and given how vital drain is to using your psionics, and how necessary your psionics are to surviving the spike in difficulty, it really needed to be explained in some kind of tutorial. But Disruptor has no tutorials of any kind, instead opting for a policy of,
just that you'll be getting a new psionic called Drain.
How's it work?
You'll figure it out.
dispensing with a tutorial might work for Crash Bandicoot, which only has 3 basic actions to choose from, but a game with this many mechanics needs to have them explained. In the Ratchet Clank games, the gadgets, which are similar to Disruptor's psionics, are highly situational, and you can't progress through the games without learning how to use them. In Disruptor, these psionics are non-situational, but progression is not locked behind learning how to use them. So why should you? It's a shooting game, and you already have weapons to shoot things with. The answer is, of course, that psionics can help you to conserve ammo and stretch out your health so that you can survive the level. But this should have been made clear from the start, and because it isn't, some players might be tempted to give up, like I was. I suppose the importance of Drain should have been obvious given what is written here in the manual. What appears to be a weak weapon is vital for you to master in the early missions, and I apologize for stopping so many times in this video to quote from the manual, but it really is a veritable fount of wisdom, containing such pearls as lava is detrimental to your health, and shooting hostages is bad form. Bad form. Not criminal or anything, but certainly not the sort of thing that you do in polite company. Anyway, I did eventually figure out Drain, which meant that for those last few levels, I was able to more consistently rely on my psionics to clear out enemies and heal damage between difficult sections. Until that point, I had been relying exclusively on my weapons, and while your weapons certainly do most of the heavy lifting, Disruptor is only at its best once you're able to effectively combine them with your psionics. Instead of exhausting your weapons and psionics and then immediately being killed, you're constantly devising strategies to keep yourself alive until you can reach the teleporter or replenish your resources. It's a highly layered risk and reward style of gameplay. With every new room or enemy, you're asking yourself, which weapon should I use here? Do I have the health to get up close and personal? Will I need this weapon to deal with a bigger threat later on? Should I use a psionic now? And if so, should I risk using Drain? Every decision has the potential to leave you with less resources than you had before, but with good strategy, you'll have the latitude to experiment and explore the branching pathways and levels without too much risk to yourself. All the while, you'll be struggling against the urge to panic when Disruptor's dynamic soundtrack, composed by David Bergeau, changes from eerie ambience to loud and dangerous battle music. It makes for some thrilling gameplay, and if you're a Ratchet Clank fan, then these tracks should sound very familiar indeed. Have a listen. You'll still die plenty of times, of course, and as with any game that requires any sort of strategy, there's a sometimes frustrating element of trial and error. But with each death, you'll change your approach and start to feel as though you're actually mastering Disruptor, rather than simply trying to force your way past it. And at that stage, Disruptor is one of the most engaging shooters that I've ever played. If you manage to beat every level and defeat the final and only boss of the game, Disruptor offers a hard mode to extend its longevity. Hard mode is essentially the New Game Plus of Disruptor, only there are no new features and you don't start with any of your weapons, psionics or upgrades from your first playthrough. So I suppose it's really just starting a new game. To be fair, hard mode does feature more enemies than before and they do pack a slightly bigger punch. And it's the only way to unlock the true ending to the story, so if you can't get enough of those live-action cutscenes, then definitely try this out after the credits roll. It isn't much, but hard mode is at least a good way of gauging how much you've improved at the game. Despite being more difficult than my first playthrough, hard mode only took me about 5 hours to finish, and that was after I'd taken some time away from playing the game. I could have finished it much sooner had I used the available cheat codes to break the game, but I have a very fragile ego. As a longtime fan of Insomniac Games, I went into Disruptor hoping to see the seeds of some of my favorite games sprinkled throughout. And I'm glad to say that after I wrapped my head around Drain, I thoroughly enjoyed myself. The gameplay is engaging and satisfying to master, two qualities that keep me coming back to the original Ratchet & Clank trilogy even today. Insomniac have always understood the value of immersing you in the gameplay right away, and introduce as many mechanics as early as possible to give you the best chance of mastering them. And by giving you abilities that have limited uses, their games suck you in, making you plan ahead and think about how you approach obstacles without bringing the action to a dead stop. That said, I can certainly see why Disruptor was barely a blip on the radar back in 1996. The controls are a bit clumsy, its difficulty comes perilously close to being unfair, and the psionics, arguably Disruptor's most unique feature, are not explained to players at all. Add to that a generic narrative, some laughably bad live-action cutscenes, and minimal marketing, and it should come as no surprise to anyone that this is the least talked about of Insomniac Games' library. Because of that, it's difficult to recommend Disruptor to anyone but the most hardcore of Insomniac Games fans or gaming history buffs. But I think that we can at least agree that without Disruptor, we wouldn't have any of its hugely successful successes. Not as we know them anyway. Ted Price originally established Insomniac Games to create shooting games, but by the time that Disruptor released, the team were so disappointed by it that they wanted to get as far away from it as possible with their next title. The result was, as Al Hastings put it, a creative pendulum swing in the opposite direction, to colorful and family-friendly platformers with Spyro the Dragon. Insomniac Games would later combine elements of Disruptor with elements of the Spyro series to create the original Ratchet & Clank for the PlayStation 2. But it wouldn't be until Resistance Fall of Man for the PlayStation 3, another 6 years later, that Insomniac Games would have the chance to return to its roots in earnest. The rest, as they say, is history. But you know how it goes. Well, I hope that I've convinced at least some of you out there to give Disruptor a try someday. In fact, let me know in the comments if I have. But if you've just enjoyed hearing more about the first Insomniac game, then I encourage you to like, press the subscribe button, follow me on Twitter and Facebook at GameAndWongerz, or check out my blog at www.wongersworld.com for a wealth of other PlayStation and Nintendo content. In the meantime, I have been and will continue to be Wongerz. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, big guns are not a euphemism for anything, whatever that means. Goodbye.